Flight 762 was scheduled for a routine departure from Chicago O'Hare to New York City, a trip that should have been nothing more than another night in the skies. The boarding process had gone smoothly, passengers settling into their seats, the hum of last-minute conversations blending with the faint announcements over the intercom. The air was thick with the usual anticipation of takeoff, that subtle mix of excitement and exhaustion that clung to travelers as they prepared for yet another flight. The cabin crew moved efficiently, closing overhead compartments, checking seat belts, offering polite smiles as they made their final rounds before takeoff. Everything seemed normal, everything was as it should be. Among the passengers was Naomi Carter, a tall, composed black woman dressed in a sharp navy blue pantsuit, her presence exuding quiet authority, even though no one around her seemed to recognize who she was. She carried herself with an effortless confidence, the kind that came with years of experience, the kind that made her look like someone who belonged, someone who understood the unspoken rhythms of travel. She had taken her seat near the middle of the plane, seemingly just another business traveler on a late-night flight, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, scanning her surroundings with the silent awareness of someone used to reading a room. Her demeanor was calm, almost detached, her focus shifting between the movements of the crew and the expressions of the passengers around her. This was a habit, a routine, something she had always done before flights, observing, analyzing, understanding how the team worked when they thought no one important was watching. What no one knew, what no one even suspected, was that Naomi Carter was not just another passenger. She was the captain of this very flight. It was a practice she had adopted years ago, an unspoken ritual she used to gauge her crew without the burden of their awareness. A leader should understand the reality of their operation from all angles, not just from the cockpit, not just from behind the title. By blending into the passengers, by watching the way her team handled the stress, the way they interacted with those on board, she could see what truly happened when she was not in uniform, when no one was watching. It was a perspective few in her position ever took the time to experience. She had done this dozens of times, and never had it led to anything more than a quiet confirmation that her team was up to standard, that her instincts in choosing and trusting her staff were correct. But tonight would be different. Tonight would spiral into something no one had foreseen. Outside, in the terminal, Officer Brian Kessler moved through the airport with the rigid posture of a man who had spent his entire career compensating for something unseen, something unspoken. His uniform was pressed to near perfection, his patrol boots scuffing against the polished floor as he walked with a sense of purpose that bordered on aggression. He was a man who had learned to mask his insecurities with authority, to wield his badge like a shield against a world he could never quite control. Tonight he was on edge. A call had come in, vague but urgent, warning of a potential security risk on board Flight 762. No names, no descriptions, just an alert sent through internal channels that someone on that plane was a threat. Kessler had heard these kinds of warnings before, and in his experience they usually pointed to the same thing: someone who didn't belong, someone who set off an instinct he had learned to trust more than facts, more than evidence. As he reached the gate, his eyes scanned the passengers already seated, his gaze flicking over rows of faces, searching for something, anything that felt off. It didn't take long for his attention to land on Naomi Carter. She sat too still, too composed. She wasn't fidgeting like the other travelers, wasn't checking her phone, wasn't showing any of the normal signs of a tired passenger waiting for takeoff. No, she sat with the quiet, unsettling calm of someone who didn't fear authority, someone who had nothing to prove. And that, more than anything, made Kessler uneasy. He gestured to the flight attendants, his expression making it clear that there was no room for argument. Moments later, the intercom crackled to life. the cabin filled with the cool, detached voice of the crew. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience, but we are experiencing a minor security delay. Please remain seated as we conduct a routine inspection." Passengers groaned, the frustration audible in the air. They were tired, restless, eager to get in the air and reach their destination. None of them had any idea what was about to unfold. Kessler boarded the plane with 2 additional officers at his side, his hand already resting near his holster as he moved down the aisle with the entitled confidence of a man who had never been questioned in his authority. He reached Naomi's row, standing over her with a look that was already filled with accusation before he even opened his mouth. "You, stand up." Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his, her gaze steady, unreadable. She didn't move. "Is there a problem?" Officer, her voice was calm, measured, free of the panic he was used to seeing when he gave orders. Kessler narrowed his eyes. "I said stand up." Passengers around them shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the officer and the woman in the seat, unsure of what was happening, but already feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Naomi didn't argue. She didn't protest. With the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had nothing to fear, she unbuckled her seatbelt and rose to her feet, standing just inches from Kessler as she met his gaze without flinching. "This way." "This way." She followed, silent, her expression betraying nothing. The passengers watched in stunned confusion as she was led toward the front of the plane, their murmurs growing louder as whispers of speculation spread through the cabin. Kessler felt the tension, but he didn't care. He had seen this before. A confident woman trying to act like she had power she didn't possess. It was always the same. But this time it wasn't the same. This time, he had no idea what he was doing. This time, he had just pulled the captain off her own plane. Naomi Carter walked down the narrow aisle of the plane, her movements deliberate, controlled, her mind already calculating the possible outcomes of the situation as the weight of countless stares pressed in on her from all sides. She could feel the growing unease in the cabin, the way passengers shifted in their seats, glancing at one another with whispered confusion, none of them fully understanding what was happening, but all of them sensing that it was something out of the ordinary. The murmurs were growing louder, the tension stretching itself thin, wrapping around the confined space like an invisible noose. Kessler walked beside her, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching near his utility belt as though he expected a fight. Naomi could read him as easily as she read the flight logs she studied before every takeoff. He was a man who thrived on control, who had built his entire understanding of authority on the idea that he was always in charge, always the one dictating the rules. But this time he was operating off assumptions he didn't even know were flawed, chasing a narrative that had already doomed him before he had even started speaking. They stepped past the first-class section, past the curtain separating the crew's workspace from the rest of the cabin, and Naomi felt the familiar shift in the air, the subtle but distinct change in atmosphere that always accompanied this part of the aircraft. The crew was watching now, their carefully maintained professionalism wavering at the sight of their own captain being escorted off the plane by law enforcement. One of the flight attendants, a young man named Jeremy, took half a step forward before hesitating, his eyes darting between Naomi and the officers, uncertainty clouding his features. Naomi caught his expression and gave the smallest shake of her head, a silent signal that told him to stand down. She didn't need anyone getting caught in the crossfire of whatever misguided authority trip Kessler was currently riding. The time for confrontation would come, but it wouldn't happen here, not in a space where any rash move could be twisted into justification for further escalation. As they stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, the stale, recycled air of the aircraft was replaced by the slightly cooler, artificial chill of the airport terminal. Kessler's grip on Naomi's arm tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to make a statement, a flex of dominance meant to remind her of who was in control. Naomi didn't resist, didn't pull away, didn't react beyond a slow, measured inhale through her nose. She could feel the layers of tension beneath his skin, the barely restrained aggression simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to be unleashed. She had seen this before, had experienced it in countless ways throughout her life, in different forms, with different faces, but always the same underlying intent to remind her that people like him thought they had power over people like her. The moment they cleared the bridge and entered the terminal, Naomi was met with a lineup of additional officers, their expressions a mix of feigned indifference and quiet anticipation, as if they were waiting for the inevitable pushback, the moment she would crack. The moment she would give them something to use against her. A small crowd had started to form, not large enough to be disruptive, but just enough to create a sense of spectacle, of something unfolding that people instinctively knew wasn't right, but weren't sure how to process. Some were pulling out their phones, but most were simply watching, the way people did when they knew they were witnessing something they might regret not paying closer attention to later. Kessler finally released her arm, stepping in front of her as he squared his shoulders, his stance widening slightly in a way that was meant to be intimidating, but only served to highlight the insecurity behind it. He looked at her, as if he expected her to run, as if he was daring her to make his job easier by reacting the way he had already decided she would. Naomi didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her expression unreadable, waiting. "You're being detained for questioning," Kessler said, his voice loud enough to carry, as if volume alone would make up for the lack of reason behind his words. Naomi arched an eyebrow, her gaze steady as she let the silence stretch between them, long enough for the weight of it to settle, for the onlookers to feel the wrongness of the situation pressing down on them like an invisible force. Questioning about what exactly. Her voice was even, not raised, not aggressive, but carrying enough authority to make it clear that she wasn't someone who could be easily dismissed. Kessler's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned. Potential security concerns, he said, his tone clipped, words chosen carefully enough to sound official, while remaining vague enough to be impossible to dispute outright. Naomi held his gaze for a beat longer before exhaling softly, shaking her head just slightly. "I see," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable weight of understanding, not understanding of his reasoning, but of the situation as a whole, of the roles they were playing in this tired, familiar scene. Kessler's patience was fraying. "I need your ID," he demanded, his posture shifting just slightly forward, as if he expected her to comply immediately, as if the demand itself should be enough to make her move. Naomi didn't move. She let the silence stretch again, watching the flicker of irritation flash across his face, the way his fingers twitched at his sides, the way the officers behind him subtly adjusted their stance, as if preparing for something. And then, in the slowest, most deliberate movement possible, Naomi reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and pulled out her credentials. Not her driver's license, not a passenger ticket, but her official pilot identification, the badge that made it undeniably clear exactly who she was. She held it up between them, the small plastic rectangle catching the artificial light of the terminal, and watched as the moment of realization hit Kessler like a physical blow. The shift in his expression was almost imperceptible, just the smallest flicker of confusion before it was quickly masked by the stubbornness of a man who refused to acknowledge his own mistakes. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Enough for Naomi to know that he understood what had just happened, that he recognized the implications of his actions, that he had been seconds away from forcibly removing the captain of the very plane he had sworn was a security threat. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't give him anything to push back against. She simply held his gaze and let the reality of the situation speak for itself. And then, with the same calm authority she had maintained from the moment this began, she spoke, her voice steady, unshaken. "Now, officer," she said, tilting her head just slightly, "do you still want to tell me I don't belong on that plane?" The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on, thick enough to make even the onlookers feel the weight of what had just happened. And for the first time that night, Kessler had no response. Kessler's grip on reality wavered for just a second, just long enough for the weight of his mistake to fully settle in his gut, an invisible punch that knocked the wind out of his arrogance. But his pride, his deeply ingrained belief in his own authority, wouldn't let him back down. His mind scrambled for a justification, a way out, a reason to continue this power play, anything to reassert control over a situation that had just spiraled out of his hands in the most humiliating way possible. He could feel the eyes on him, his officers, the onlookers, the airline staff, all waiting, watching, expecting him to fix this, to untangle himself from the web of his own making. But there was no easy escape, no quick reversal that wouldn't make him look even weaker than he already did. His body moved before his brain could catch up, his hand tightening on the belt near his radio, a defensive instinct, as though grasping at his uniform could somehow reaffirm the authority that was slipping through his fingers. Naomi Carter did not move. She remained perfectly still, her face composed, her body language betraying nothing but the same calm self-assurance she had displayed since the moment he had yanked her from her seat. That was what was eating at him. That was what had been wrong from the beginning. She had never once shown fear. Not when he had confronted her, not when he had grabbed her, not when he had paraded her off the plane like some suspect caught in the act. It was unnatural in the way that made his skin crawl, because he was used to people reacting to his presence. He was used to anger, frustration, panic, the usual emotional cocktails that spilled over when people found themselves on the receiving end of police intervention. But she had given him nothing. No cracks, no hesitation, no outburst to latch onto and use against her. She was controlling the entire tempo of this confrontation without lifting a single finger, and he hated it. The other officers sensed it too. There was an unspoken tension, a stiffness in their posture that hadn't been there before, an uncertainty that came with watching their superior fumble on the edge of a disastrous realization. One of them, a younger officer with a hesitant expression, cleared his throat slightly, as if about to speak, but Kessler cut him off before a single word could escape. "We're not done here," he snapped, his voice sharp, cutting through the air like a crack of a whip. He had to keep going now. Stopping meant admitting fault, admitting that he had misjudged the entire situation, that he had embarrassed himself in front of his team, in front of the public, in front of this woman who had refused to fold under his authority. Naomi exhaled slowly through her nose, a movement so subtle that it barely registered, but to Kessler it felt like an insult, like a sign of someone who had already moved past this encounter, as if she had already written him off as inconsequential. It only fueled his anger. "This isn't over," he repeated louder this time, as if saying it again would somehow make it true. He needed a reason, a justification, something to reframe the narrative before it got too far out of his control. And then it came to him. Security concerns. That was the term he had used when pulling her off the plane, the excuse he had leaned on without a second thought. He could double down on it. It was the only option left. He squared his shoulders, lifting his chin slightly, his voice steadying into the firm, authoritative cadence he had used his entire career. "Regardless of your position, I have reason to believe that there is still a credible security threat on board, and until I complete my investigation, you are not stepping back onto that plane there." He had drawn the line. The moment the words left his mouth, he knew there was no backing down. He had just escalated the situation past the point of no return. Naomi studied him, her dark eyes flicking over his face, like she was reading every unspoken word behind his statement, dissecting every lie he had just constructed to protect his pride. For the first time, a hint of something flickered across her expression: disappointment. Not anger, not indignation, but the kind of disappointment that one feels when watching someone throw away their last chance at redemption. "You're making this worse for yourself, officer," she said, her voice softer now, not a warning, not a threat, just a statement of fact. But Kessler ignored it. His officers were looking to him for direction, and he needed to keep them on his side. "Secure her," he ordered sharply, and before Naomi could respond, two officers stepped forward. One grabbed her by the arm, the other reaching for his cuffs. The mistake was instantaneous. Naomi moved, her body shifting with the kind of effortless speed that came from years of training, her arm twisting free from the officer's grip in one fluid motion. In the same instant, her foot pivoted, redirecting the energy of the second officer's advance, using his own momentum against him. Before anyone could process what had happened, the younger officer found himself spun off balance, his wrist bent at an unnatural angle, his knee buckling as Naomi's leverage sent him to the floor. The terminal exploded into chaos. The other officers moved, hands reaching for their weapons, but Naomi had already stepped back, her hands raised in a show of non-aggression, even as the fallen officer groaned on the floor, clutching his wrist in shock. "Don't be stupid," she said, her voice calm but edged with a sharp warning. "You know exactly what just happened here. I didn't attack. I defended." But Kessler was beyond reason now. He had lost too much control, too much face, and all he could see was the woman standing in front of him, the woman who had just humiliated his entire team without breaking a sweat. His fury overtook logic, and before he could stop himself, he lunged. It was a blind move, reckless and uncalculated, an act of pure desperation from a man who had never been in a real fight in his life. Naomi stepped to the side at the last second, her body shifting just enough to evade him completely. Kessler's momentum carried him forward, and he stumbled, losing his footing just long enough for Naomi to sidestep behind him. And then, with practiced precision, she reached out, grabbed the open handcuffs still dangling from the younger officer's belt, and in one smooth motion, snapped them shut around Kessler's wrist. Silence fell over the terminal. Kessler froze, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts, the cold steel of the cuffs pressing against his skin, the weight of them sinking into his reality. He turned, his movements slow, his face a mask of rage and disbelief as he looked down at his wrist, the realization settling in like a slow burning fire. Naomi stepped back, her posture once again completely composed, as if the last 10 seconds hadn't just happened, as if she hadn't just flipped the entire power dynamic in an instant. "You're done," she said simply. Kessler's entire world shattered. His officers stared at him, at her, at the scene that had just unfolded, at the captain of the plane they had just tried to detain now standing in front of them, utterly untouchable. And somewhere, in the depths of his rage, in the crushing weight of his humiliation, Brian Kessler realized the truth. He had just destroyed his own career with his own hands, and there was no coming back from it. The cold bite of steel around Kessler's wrist sent a shock through his entire body, but the real impact, the real devastation came from the way the entire terminal seemed to inhale at once, an almost audible gasp as every witness to his failure processed what had just happened. The power had shifted, completely and irreversibly. Just a few minutes ago, he had been the one in control, the one dictating the pace of the encounter, the one giving orders. Now he stood frozen, his wrist locked in his own set of handcuffs, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him like a vice. Naomi Carter stood before him, calm, composed, completely in control, as if none of this had fazed her in the slightest. She hadn't even broken a sweat. That, more than anything, made his stomach turn. The officers around them didn't know what to do. It was clear in the hesitation in their movements, the darting glances between each other, the unspoken question hanging thick in the air, what now? None of them had ever seen a situation flip this quickly, this violently, and none of them had the faintest idea how to react. One of them, the younger officer Naomi had disarmed so effortlessly, was still cradling his wrist, his breathing shallow, the pain from the maneuver keeping him stunned. Another had taken half a step forward when Naomi had cuffed Kessler, his instinct pushing him to intervene. But now he lingered in place, uncertainty paralyzing him. None of them wanted to be the one to escalate this further, to be the one to make the next mistake. Naomi knew it. She saw the hesitation, the silent breakdown in the so-called order they had been so sure of just moments before. The balance of power had been thrown off its axis, and none of them knew how to reset it. Kessler's breath came fast and uneven, the muscles in his jaw twitching as he clenched his teeth, willing himself not to lash out, not to completely lose control in front of his subordinates, in front of the crowd, in front of the woman who had just dismantled him without even trying. He wanted to strike back, to reclaim even a fraction of the authority that had just been ripped from him, but he couldn't move. His body wouldn't let him. Not while her eyes were still locked onto his, watching him with something he couldn't even put into words. It wasn't pity, wasn't arrogance, wasn't even satisfaction. It was something worse. It was patience. She was waiting for him to come to terms with the simple, undeniable truth of what had just happened. "You need to step down, officer," she said, her voice measured, calm but firm. She wasn't asking. She was telling him. The words sent a fresh wave of heat through his skull. Kessler exhaled sharply, the sound more growl than breath. "You don't get to tell me what to do," but even as he said it, the words felt hollow. He didn't sound convincing, not even to himself. Naomi tilted her head slightly, and for the first time, her lips twitched into the faintest trace of a smirk. It wasn't arrogance. It was amusement. As if she had seen men like him 1,000 times before, and already knew exactly how this would end. "Then what's your plan, officer?" she asked, her voice still infuriatingly composed. "Are you going to have your men arrest me? Charge me with what exactly? Defending myself? Resisting an unlawful detainment? Assaulting an officer who attacked first?" Her gaze flicked briefly to the cameras still recording, the passengers and bystanders who had their phones up, capturing every second of this disaster. "You've already lost, Kessler. The only choice you have left is how much worse you want to make this for yourself." The reality of it crashed into him like a freight train. She was right. He had nothing left. No justification, no excuses, no backup plan. His officers weren't moving. The passengers weren't siding with him. And the cameras, the cameras were still rolling, catching every humiliating second of his downfall. There was no spinning this, no way to frame himself as the victim here. He had lost. Completely. His body betrayed him first. His fingers twitched, his breath hitched, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. Naomi saw it. She recognized the exact moment he accepted it, even if he wasn't ready to say it out loud. "Let's make this easy," she continued, her tone softer now, almost gentle. "I'll remove the cuffs, and you'll stand down. You'll let your men handle this properly, without whatever personal grudge you're holding onto, and I'll go back to doing my job. Because let's be honest, Officer Kessler, you and I both know you can't stop me from getting back on that plane." The beat of silence. And then, with painstaking reluctance, Kessler gave the smallest nod. Barely there, barely a movement at all, but enough. Naomi reached forward, and with the same effortless precision she had used to lock the cuffs, she unfastened them. The metal clicked, and Kessler pulled his hands back quickly, rubbing at the skin as if trying to erase the feeling of them altogether. He wanted to say something, to snap back with one last biting remark, but Naomi was already turning, already walking back toward the jet bridge with the smooth, confident stride of someone who had never once doubted that this was how it would end. The officers parted for her, instinctively making way, none of them daring to meet her gaze as she passed. She didn't look back. Didn't acknowledge Kessler again. She didn't have to. Because by the time she stepped back onto the plane, settling into the cockpit, fastening her harness, and wrapping her hands around the controls, Brian Kessler had already ceased to exist in her world. The moment Naomi Carter stepped back onto the plane, the energy in the cabin shifted. It wasn't just relief, it was something heavier, something unspoken yet deeply felt by every single passenger who had witnessed what had just transpired outside. Some of them had pieced it together already, recognizing the shift in power dynamics, the way the officers had backed off, the way Naomi had walked past them untouched, unscathed, completely in control. Others were still trying to catch up, unsure of whether to be afraid, confused, or simply awed by what they had just seen. But the truth was undeniable now. The woman Kessler had dragged off this plane was not just another passenger. She was their pilot. She was the captain of this flight. And she was back exactly where she belonged. Naomi moved with measured steps, her posture unchanged, her breathing even. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't thrown off course. If anything, she looked as if nothing had even happened. As if she had simply taken a brief detour before returning to her station. As if she had never been forcefully removed, humiliated, and physically confronted by a man who had mistaken his own prejudice for authority. She could feel the weight of their stares, the mixture of admiration and uncertainty from those watching, but she didn't acknowledge them. There was no need. She had already won the battle. The war, however, was not over. Jeremy, the young flight attendant, who had hesitated when she was first taken off the plane, was now standing near the cockpit entrance, his face pale, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His eyes darted toward her, then quickly down to the floor, as if afraid to say something wrong, to acknowledge the obvious truth in front of him. He finally swallowed, forcing himself to speak. "Captain," he said, the word coming out more like an exhale than a statement. Naomi nodded once, a silent confirmation of what he already knew. "Everything's under control," she said, her voice as steady as ever, as if she were giving an in-flight update over the intercom rather than stepping back into a position she had just been unlawfully stripped of. But before she could move into the cockpit, the disturbance she had been anticipating finally arrived. Heavy, rapid footsteps on the jet bridge. The sound of boots against metal, urgent and determined. It wasn't over yet. Naomi turned just as Kessler stormed back onto the plane, his face flushed red with fury, his breath coming fast and ragged. He had lost, he knew he had lost, but his body hadn't caught up with his brain yet. He wasn't ready to accept it. He couldn't. He needed to reassert himself, needed to prove to himself, to his officers, to the passengers that he was still the one in control, even if he had to break something to do it. Stop, his voice rang out through the cabin, sharp and commanding, laced with barely contained rage. Passengers jumped, some gasping in shock, others instinctively leaning away, pressing themselves against their seats, as if bracing for another confrontation. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was unraveling. "You're not going anywhere," he spat, pointing directly at Naomi. "You think you can just walk back onto this plane like nothing happened? Like you didn't just attack an officer? Like you didn't just..." His voice cut off abruptly, the words dying in his throat as Naomi turned to face him fully. Not just turning, but stepping toward him. She wasn't retreating. She wasn't standing still, waiting for him to make his next move. She was closing the distance between them. The shift was immediate, a silent but undeniable declaration of dominance. She wasn't afraid of him. Not now. Not ever. Kessler realized too late that he had made another mistake. His instinct had always been to intimidate, to control through presence, through size, through sheer force of will. But Naomi wasn't backing down. She was stepping into him, into his space, into his air. And for the first time since this had started, he felt small. "You need to leave this plane," Officer Naomi said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Now." Kessler's fingers twitched near his belt, near the holster where his weapons sat. The tension in his muscles betrayed him, the impulse to act overriding common sense, overriding rationality. He was losing control, losing face, losing everything, and his body was screaming at him to do something. But before he could, Naomi took another step closer. "You are interfering with a federal flight operation," she continued, her tone as calm as ever, but carrying a weight that made the air in the cabin feel heavier. "Do you understand what that means?" She didn't give him time to answer. "That means you are endangering this aircraft. You are jeopardizing the safety of every single person on this flight." Kessler's mouth opened, but no words came out. His skin burned with humiliation, his vision tunneling, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. He had nothing. He had no argument, no defense, no justification. Every single pair of eyes in the cabin was on him now, and he could feel the collective shift in perception, the way the crowd had turned against him. He was no longer the authority here. He was the threat. And then, the final blow. Naomi leaned in, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "Do you know what happens when someone interferes with a flight?" Officer, her breath was steady, her tone controlled, but the words carried a razor's edge. "I could have you detained right now. I could have you pulled off this plane, placed under arrest, and charged with a federal crime. And there wouldn't be a single person here who would defend you." For the first time, true panic flickered in Kessler's eyes. The weight of what he had done, the magnitude of the consequences, finally broke through the fog of his fury. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Naomi straightened, taking a slow step back, giving him the space to make his own choice, to either dig himself deeper into the hole he had created or to finally step away. The entire plane was silent, waiting, holding its breath. And then, finally, Kessler exhaled. His hands unclenched. His shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him like air from a punctured lung. Without another word, without looking at Naomi, without acknowledging the catastrophe he had created, he turned on his heel and walked off the plane. The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi let out a slow breath, closing her eyes for just a moment before turning back to the flight crew. "Let's get back to work," she said simply. Jeremy nodded, his body still tense with residual adrenaline. "Yes, Captain." Naomi stepped into the cockpit, settling into her seat, her fingers instinctively moving over the controls, her mind shifting back into the space where she was most at home, most in control. The weight of the past hour settled into her bones, but she didn't let it linger. It was done. It was over, and the only thing left to do now was take off. Naomi Carter sat in the cockpit, hands steady on the controls, her breathing even as she adjusted the settings with precision. Every movement was second nature, her fingers gliding over switches and dials in a familiar rhythm. It was what she had done 1,000 times before, but this time something was different. The weight of the last hour pressed against her like turbulence that hadn't quite settled. Outside, the world had seen the confrontation, had witnessed the battle of control, But inside this cockpit, she was in command in a way no one could challenge. This was her domain, her sky, and no officer, no badge, no misplaced authority was going to take that from her. She could hear Jeremy moving behind her, still shaken but functioning. She needed him focused. The entire crew had been rattled, thrown into a situation none of them had been trained for. Sure, they had procedures for dealing with unruly passengers, medical emergencies, even in-flight technical malfunctions, but no handbook covered what to do when your own captain was dragged off the plane in front of an audience. No protocol explained how to steady a crew after an authority figure had turned a place of order into a battleground. Naomi knew she had to be the one to set the tone. She flicked on the intercom, her voice coming through the cabin with its usual clarity, unwavering, controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now cleared for takeoff. Sit back, relax, and we'll have you on your way shortly." There was a beat of silence before a murmur of relief rippled through the passengers. The tension in the air loosened, if only slightly. People wanted normalcy, wanted to move past what they had just witnessed, to believe that everything was under control again. Naomi made sure they believed it, but not everyone was ready to move on. The ground crew had just finalized the last clearance checks when movement on the tarmac caught Naomi's attention. She glanced out the side window and saw them, two uniformed officers, standing near the terminal exit, one holding a radio to his mouth, the other staring at the plane with a look that made something in Naomi's gut tighten. Kessler. He wasn't done. The thought made her fingers tighten around the throttle. He had already lost, already humiliated himself beyond repair, and yet there he was, lingering like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Naomi had seen men like him before, people who couldn't handle being wrong, who would rather self-destruct than admit their own failure. They didn't just let things go. They didn't walk away quietly, and that made them dangerous. Jeremy leaned in, voice low. "Captain, ground control says there's no reason for delay, but they're waiting to see if those officers make a move." Naomi exhaled through her nose, her mind calculating. Kessler had already pushed his limits, already crossed lines he couldn't uncross, but now he was at a crossroads. He could take his loss and walk away, let the plane leave, accept that he had been overruled. Or he could double down. And if he doubled down, it meant escalation, a level of risk no one on this flight needed. She didn't trust him not to make the wrong choice. Without hesitation, she reached for the intercom again. But this time, her message wasn't for the passengers. It was for the airport authorities. "This is Captain Carter. Flight 762 is prepared for takeoff, but I need confirmation that security will not be interfering with this departure. If there's an issue, I want it on record now." A brief pause, then a crackling response from ground control. "Understood, Captain. We're monitoring the situation. Hold position." Another pause. Then a new voice came through, one with authority laced into every word. "Flight 762, you are cleared for immediate takeoff. Proceed as scheduled." Naomi didn't need to ask what had happened. Someone higher up had overridden Kessler's last desperate attempt at control. Someone had seen the situation for what it was, a liability. The officers by the terminal stiffened, receiving what was clearly an order they didn't like. Naomi watched as Kessler turned sharply, radio in hand, his posture rigid as he spoke into the device. He was arguing, fighting whatever command had come down from above. And then, just like that, he was pulled off the tarmac. One of the senior officers, perhaps a supervisor, perhaps someone who understood just how deep the mess had become, physically placed a hand on Kessler's shoulder, forcing him to turn back toward the airport terminal. His stance resisted, but his body language betrayed him. He had no more plays left. He had been removed from the field. Naomi exhaled, feeling the last piece of tension leave her chest as she turned back to her controls. "Prepare for takeoff," she said, and this time it was final. The engines roared to life, a sound that had never felt more satisfying. As the plane gained speed down the runway, Naomi kept her eyes forward, the vast stretch of asphalt ahead of her giving way to the open sky. The weight of the past hour still clung to the air around her, but it was behind her now. The moment the wheels lifted from the ground, she left it all behind. She had won. Not just the confrontation, not just the battle of authority. She had won something bigger, the right to do her job without having to fight for it, without having to justify her existence in a space she had already earned. As the altitude climbed, as the city lights blurred beneath them, she took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. Kessler was gone. The flight was hers again, and above all else, she was flying. As Flight 762 climbed into the night sky, leaving the chaos of the airport behind, Naomi Carter kept her hands steady on the controls, her focus locked on the instrument panel, her breath slow and even. The tension in the cockpit had dissipated, replaced by the steady hum of the engines and the quiet routine of piloting a commercial airliner. This was where she belonged. Up here there was no Kessler, no uniformed threats, no misplaced authority trying to wrestle control away from her. Up here, the only thing that mattered was skill, precision, and the trust that hundreds of passengers had placed in her to guide them safely to their destination. And that was exactly what she would do. Jeremy, still shaken but visibly relieved, leaned against the doorframe of the cockpit, arms crossed over his chest. That was he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That was insane. I mean, I've seen some crazy things on flights, but that was something else. He hesitated, then met Naomi's gaze. "You all right, Captain?" Naomi allowed herself a small nod, her grip firm on the yoke. "I've been through worse," she said simply, and it wasn't a lie. She had spent years carving her place in an industry that had, at times, tried to push her out. She had endured the quiet discrimination, the subtle dismissals, the microaggressions that came with being both a black woman and a leader in a field dominated by men who thought she needed to prove herself twice as hard just to be seen as competent. But today had been different. Today hadn't been subtle. Today had been an open, undisguised attempt to strip her of her authority, her dignity, her position, all under the assumption that she didn't belong where she was. And today, she had made damn sure they understood exactly how wrong they had been. Jeremy hesitated again, then took a breath. "You handled it better than I would have. Honestly, I don't know how you stayed that calm." Naomi let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no real humor behind it. Experienced, she glanced at the instrument panel, checking their altitude, making sure everything was as it should be. People like Kessler, they don't expect you to stay calm. They expect fear. They expect anger. They expect something they can control. The moment you give them that, they win. Jeremy absorbed her words, his expression thoughtful, before giving a slow nod. "Yeah, I see that now." The flight continued smoothly, the turbulence of the earlier conflict left behind on the tarmac. For the passengers, things had returned to normal, just another routine flight, the events before takeoff becoming nothing more than an unbelievable story they would tell when they landed. Some of them had recorded it, of course. Some had posted about it. The world would see it soon, would hear about how a uniformed officer had tried to remove the pilot of her own flight under false pretenses, would watch as the situation unraveled and Kessler's authority crumbled beneath the weight of his own arrogance. But for Naomi, this wasn't about going viral. This wasn't about making headlines. This was about something bigger. This was about making sure this never happened again. To her, to anyone. Hours later, As Flight 762 made its descent into New York, Naomi went through the landing checklist with the same smooth efficiency as always. The runway lights stretched ahead of them, a path of clarity guiding them back to solid ground. The moment the wheels touched down, the soft jolt of contact rippling through the cabin, a strange sense of finality settled over her. She had taken off as the rightful captain of this flight. Now she had returned as the same. The taxi to the gate was uneventful, and as the plane came to a full stop, the intercom crackled to life. Naomi's voice, calm and professional, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. On behalf of the crew, we thank you for your patience tonight. We know it's been an eventful flight, and we appreciate you flying with us. We hope to see you again soon." There was a beat of silence. Then a ripple of applause. It started small, hesitant, but grew quickly, spreading through the cabin, voices murmuring in agreement. They knew, they understood, they had watched it happen. Naomi took a breath and stood, stretching out the stiffness in her muscles as she stepped out of the cockpit. The first-class passengers were already standing, gathering their bags, stretching their limbs, but all of them turned when she emerged. Some nodded in silent respect. Others murmured quiet thanks. A few, the ones who had witnessed the worst of it, made a point of shaking her hand. One woman, a middle-aged traveler with tired eyes, squeezed Naomi's fingers a little tighter than necessary and simply said, "That was something." Naomi nodded, giving a small smile but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Jeremy stood by the door as passengers began to disembark, but before Naomi could exit, his earpiece crackled, and he turned slightly, listening. Then, he stiffened. "Captain," he said slowly, "you might want to see this." She frowned but followed his gaze toward the terminal's glass windows, and there just outside the gate, under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the airport, stood Kessler. But he wasn't standing tall anymore. His uniform was disheveled, his badge missing from his chest. Two higher-ranking officers stood beside him, one speaking in a low voice, the other watching as Kessler's face darkened with barely restrained anger. A supervisor Naomi didn't recognize stood a few feet away, arms crossed, observing the exchange with an expression of pure disapproval. And then, the moment of finality, one of the officers reached forward, unclipped something from Kessler's shoulder, and removed his badge completely. His body went rigid, his face drained of color, his mouth opening as if to protest before shutting again. There was no fight left in him now. Naomi exhaled slowly, watching as the officers led him away, their pace firm but unhurried. Kessler's career had just crumbled in the same way his authority had back on the tarmac. There would be no salvaging this. His mistake hadn't just cost him respect. It had cost him everything. She turned away from the sight, stepping off the jet bridge and into the terminal. The world outside was already moving forward, passengers rushing toward baggage claim, voices filling the space with normalcy. For them, the flight was over. For Naomi, it was just another reminder of what it took to survive in a world that still doubted her right to be here. But she had survived. She had won. And as she walked toward the exit, her head held high, she knew one thing for certain. No one would ever question her place in the skies again.